Welcome to another episode of Sounds Reasonable. I am your host, Dr. Brad, and I'm joined in the production of our weekly show by Tim and Tracy. We're all members of the Free Thought community, and our Sounds Reasonable website can be found on Facebook. Do you experience frequent irrational thoughts, a pervasive belief in a divine skydive, an insatiable urge to read horoscopes, perform spells, speak in tongues, or pray? Fortunately, you are now listening to the cure for these ailments. Sounds Reasonable. This show is dedicated to bringing you, the listener, the latest news in free thought, science, logic and reason, and politics and religion. And of course, we encourage you to share your thoughts with us after each episode by posting comments and asking questions on our Facebook page. What is free thought? What does it mean to be a free thinker? The dictionary definition is a person who forms opinions about religion based on reason, independent of tradition, authority, or established belief. Here's Christopher Hitchens' working definition. Our belief is not a belief. Our principles are not a faith. We do not rely solely upon science and reason because these are necessary rather than sufficient factors. But we distrust anything that contradicts science or outrages reason. We may differ on many things, but what we respect is free inquiry, open-mindedness, and the pursuit of ideas for their own sake. We'll now move on to our science news segment, and remember that the scientific mind is one that allows its perceptions of reality to be constrained by good evidence and good argument. Well, when we think of an arms race, we typically think of the Cold War between the US and the former Soviet Union. But there are other quote-unquote arms races that warrant our attention. The one I'm going to discuss today is the race between our immune system protecting us from viruses and those same viruses evading the immune response to them. Now, we've mentioned this before, but one of the key mechanisms we have available to combat viruses is interferon. And interferons are small proteins that are secreted by various immune system cells as well as our regular somatic, that is, body cells, in response to an infection. Now, once produced and secreted, interferons will establish in the neighboring cells. So note that the cell that actually does the secreting of interferon is not itself protected. So this is kind of a form of self-sacrifice here. But once produced and secreted, the interferons will establish in neighboring cells what is described as the antiviral state. Now, this consists of interferon-stimulated genes that primarily target a virus's ability to produce the proteins it needs to replicate. The basic idea behind interferon is to prevent spread and thus limit the viral infection. So, Tim, if I could have the first figure, please. Okay, so this figure illustrates the basic mechanism of how interferon works. So starting with a virus infecting a cell. Okay, so the virus enters the cell, begins replication, and we have sensors in the cell that result in the activation of interferon genes. Once the genes have been activated, they start producing interferon, which is then secreted and recognized by receptors of neighboring cells. And so that's what is being circled right now. So note the little reddish-brown globules that are being bound by the blue receptors. Now this occurs on the cell surface of the neighboring cells, and this allows a signal to be transduced, it's called, or signal transduction. So the signal is transduced to the nucleus, And this signal then turns on interferon stimulated genes, and those inhibit viral protein synthesis. Okay, and so as a result, virus replication is unable to get underway in these cells, and those cells survive, even though we end up sacrificing the initial cell or cells that were infected and produced the interferon. Now, to get interferon turned on in the first place, we need to be able to sense the presence of a virus in the cell, and we briefly alluded to that in the left-hand panel of the figure you're viewing at the moment. Now, to do this, we have various molecules that can detect foreign nucleic acid. Now, of course, our DNA is present in the nucleus of the cell, not in the cytoplasm. So the presence of cytoplasmic DNA is a signal that something is wrong. Okay, and most notably, it could be a replication of a virus. We also have receptors that can detect other types of nucleic acids produced by other types of viruses, such as single-stranded RNA and double-stranded RNA. Now, binding of these intracellular receptors results in a signal by a molecule known as STING. That's spelled exactly as you would think, S-T-I-N-G. And STING stands for Stimulator of Interferon Genes. So this signal results in the production of interferon. So Tim, if I could have the next figure, please. Okay, so note that on the upper left, we have double-stranded DNA that's in the cytoplasm. The nucleus is indicated to the right. It's bound by the brown oval shape or brown rectangles. And then you've got the type 1 interferon genes within the nucleus. So the double-stranded DNA that's found in the cytoplasm is going to be perceived as an invasion. Now, that's recognized by a couple of molecules that eventually result in stimulating the molecule known as STING, and that's down in the bottom left hand. Now, when STING gets properly stimulated, we produce molecules that will result in the activation of the expression of interferons. And so you have a molecule known as NF-kappa B and another molecule that's labeled IRF3, which stands for interferon response factor 3. Now, remembering all that isn't really what's important. Realize that it's the stimulation of STING that really gets everything going. Okay, so if we can't stimulate STING, none of those other events or none of those other events take place. Now, if you're going to be a successful pathogen or a disease-causing agent, you have to be able to circumvent the host's immune response. Now, previous coronavirus infections were shown to be able to evade the interferon response, as does the current COVID-19 or CoV-2 coronavirus. Now, the way it does this is to interfere with the STING signaling. So, Tim, if I could have the next slide, please. Okay, and this figure looks like it's really busy, but really the only thing I want to focus in on for our purposes today is pretty much right in the middle. So you'll notice STING, and STING has these UV molecules attached to it. That's an important step for the activation of STING when you have foreign nucleic acid detected in the cell. Now, various viruses have developed the ability to block the addition of those UV molecules to sting. And so you'll note that we have human coronavirus, so that's what that HCOV stands for. And then you probably remember SARS. Okay, so that is also another coronavirus. Okay, and what's not shown on here is COVID-19 or CoV-2, but that would also be in that same box. Okay, and so they encode a protein or proteins that inhibits the addition of those UV molecules to sting, and as a result prevents sting's activation. And so if you recall from the previous figure, okay, the downstream steps or the next steps in the sequence of the pathway are necessary to get the production of interferon. And so Tim's doing a great job of circling what comes next. Okay, and then if you remember NF kappa B, so that's that P50 and P65, and then interferon response factor 3. Okay, so again, without sting being activated, those molecules will remain inactive, and as a result, you do not produce interferon. And so that, okay, hopefully explains why CoV-2 is good at inhibiting the production of interferon. And again, if you're going to be a good pathogen, you have to be able to do these things. And you'll note that there's a great number of viruses that target this pathway, not necessarily at the same spots. Okay, we've got all sorts of different routes by which viruses attack this pathway. So it's very clear that in order to be a successful virus, you need to knock down interferon production. Now, of course, the hope is that our understanding of this pathway will allow us to develop antiviral drugs that would block the ability of viruses to inhibit the interferon response. That is, we're going to inhibit the inhibitor. And these could be administered in a prophylactic fashion or after an acquired infection. Okay, so let's have some discussion on this. So what do you think?
Well, one reason I'm not doing the science portion is because I'm not a scientist. How would you explain that to somebody who knows nothing about science? Like
yeah, so to explain it in those terms, I would start out by saying that interferon does exactly what its name implies. Okay, it interferes with the ability of viruses to reproduce themselves. In order for viruses to reproduce themselves, they have to interfere with the interferon. Okay, if they fail to do that, then they're not going to be very successful.
Right.
Okay, and so that's really the bottom line of the whole thing.
Okay.
And yeah, because that really works in conjunction with your immune response, but that interferon response is going to be a little quicker. And so yeah, if you're like losing one of your tools to help you combat virus infection.
Yes, so interferon, as Tim rightly pointed out, reacts very quickly, typically within 6 to 12 hours of infection. So for a virus to get itself established, it's going to have to interfere with that interferon reaction. And interferon is part of what we describe as the innate immune system, meaning that it's all carried out at the level of the genes. Okay, so there's no adaptation to the pathogen necessary for this reaction to take place.
Okay.
I envision some nice coevolution going on here with with the virus probably producing that ability to inactivate the interferon. So make a nice, probably a little lesson in some coevolution and that battle between host and pathogen.
Oh, definitely. Viruses, because of the speed at which they can replicate, are oftentimes the biggest challenge. So what you hope for is that the virus you're combating is not what we would refer to as being real plastic, that is not real flexible in what it has to do.
Right.
And the more flexible it is, the easier it is to mutate to a form that can circumvent the immune response. We're, for example, poliovirus is very inflexible.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the polio vaccine has been so successful. And in essence, you only have to take it during your early years in life, and you don't have to be re-immunized later on. Because poliovirus does not evolve new mutational forms that allows it to circumvent the immune response produced by the vaccine. Whereas influenza is highly plastic.
Right.
Okay, it's able to dodge the immune response pretty much on an annual basis, and that's why we have to get an annual flu vaccine. You get an annual flu vaccination.
And initially, it's looking like maybe the coronavirus is not very plastic, right, Brad? Isn't that what they're not easily mutating?
Right, but what's interesting there is that it appears to be for a different reason. Most RNA viruses genomes are relatively small.
Mm-hmm.
Typically about 10,000 bases or less. Some will reach around 12 or so, but again, the average is probably around 6 to 7,000 bases for RNA viruses. With coronavirus, here we've got an RNA virus that is around 30,000 bases.
Right.
Okay, and it, before they had identified coronaviruses, they thought that this would not be possible because of the high mutational rate that the enzymes that are involved in reproducing the viral genetic material are not real efficient.
Right.
But as it turns out, for coronavirus, they have evolved a system that allows them to repair RNA during its synthesis. And so as a result, they are almost kind of an intermediate, if you will, between DNA replication and RNA replication.
Mm-hmm.
So rather fascinating.
Yes. And did I, on that last cartoon, did I see was the herpes simplex virus one of those that was able to block sting?
Yes. Yes.
So I guess you could envision that's one way that it's part of its ability to hide and remain, it's hiding within the nervous system, but being able to remain. I suppose that's would be an added plus for its ability to not be cleared from the body.
Right. The ability of herpes viruses to become latent is well known.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the most notorious of those would be chicken pox versus shingles.
Right.
So typically you'll have, if you get chicken pox, you're going to typically get it as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And you typically will not develop shingles till much later in life, 50s, 60s, 70s. But it's the same virus.
Yes.
It's just been hiding, waiting for an opportunity to reemerge.
And I hear it's not fun at all. It's not.
No, my mother had it, unfortunately, and she was absolutely miserable.
Yeah.
But by the way, they do have a vaccine for shingles now, and I've had mine. I should get one. If you have not had it, but you did have chicken pox, I would get it.
I better get it.
So that's going to be the big plus here, however. because now they have a vaccine for chickenpox.
Right.
And so we're going to have a generation of people that will no longer need the shingles vaccine.
Yeah. Great.
Because they'll have already,
Okay.
they'll be immune to the virus in the first place and will have never acquired the infection.
Cool. Okay.
Okay, anything else?
Very good.
All right, so we'll be right back with more Sounds Reasonable after this short break.
Maybe.
Is there music?
I've lost my music background. Where's my lost my iTunes. There it is, sorry.
All alive. The devil's in the detail, lingered inside. Oh, a holy crime. But how can I hide you without an alibi? It's a reckless fight without an alibi. You took my innocence. I can't wait no longer. I'm playing with the monsters. Everything that brought me alive. Though we're all like monsters, playing with the monsters. They brought me alive, but got no alibi. It's a reckless fight without an alibi. You took my innocence without an alibi. Oh, smoking gun. You got me on the run. We know that will come. We're out up till dawn. But how can I hide it without an alibi?
And we're back with more Sounds Reasonable on this Father's Day, June 21st, 2020. And happy summer solstice, by the way, everyone.
Yes.
Now, what is it about public education that the religious right continuously targets it in various ways? In Tennessee, a bill that is now ready for the governor's signature was passed unanimously by both the state's Congress and Senate that will allow parents to let their children attend 1 hour per day. You heard that right, not week, not month, per day of religious instruction during the school day. Tracy has the story. So Tracy, what's going on in Tennessee?
All right. Yes, the story I'm going to talk about is entitled "A Bill Letting Kids in Tennessee Miss an Hour of School a Day to Go to Church." And it's heading to the governor's desk. A bill requiring Tennessee schools to let students miss an hour of class a day to go to church passed unanimously in the General Assembly. And this was reported on June the 12th on businessinsider.com. Last year, the Knox County School Board tested a policy allowing students to miss 1 class a month for church services. Governor Bill Lee hasn't commented on the bill, but he previously declared a statewide day of fasting and prayer ongoing opioid epidemic. And I'm pretty sure there's no longer an opioid epidemic, so that worked. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure it's all cleared up by now.
Right. To prevent participants To prevent participants from missing mandatory lessons, schools would have to cut over 22 days of classes for all students, according to the American Atheists. Let's see. Here we go. The Tennessee House of Representatives passed HB 2542 unanimously on last Monday, after a similar victory in the state Senate last week. The measure now heads to Governor Bill Lee, who is expected to sign it into law. Yes. Introduced by Representative Dennis Powers, Representative Dennis Powers, Republican out of Jacksboro, and Senator Ken Yeager, Republican out of Kingston. It mandates public schools to excuse a student to attend a released time course in religious moral instructions for no more than one class period per school day. Sounds to me like a way to get kids out of school early, honestly. I mean, we used to have that study hall and journalism. We were always selling ads off campus. Anyway, if that's requested by a parent or a student, HB 2542 also authorizes public school buses to be used to transport those students, provided the religious institute reimburses the Board of Education. Programs that allow for off-campus prayer or private religious education during school hours are typically known as, quote, released time. Current Tennessee allows students to take released time if it's approved by the local school board. The new measure would allow it regardless of whether the local Board of Education has adopted a policy. So I guess they've been doing this release time thing, sort of a blanket, like get out of school for release time, and it encompassed being able to practice religion. Release time initiatives began in the US in the 1910s and expanded through the 1940s when they met their first constitutional challenges. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that schools were not allowed to use public resources to support such programs. Later rulings established that such programs cannot be held on school property and that students cannot be coerced into participating. However, schools are allowed to offer academic credit for release time programs if they meet certain criteria. Does that mean that they can get academic credit for attending church an hour a day?
Wow.
Do you guys interpret that way? Okay. And this kind of reminds me of the whole see you at the poll deal. Do they do that where you're at, where all the students meet? And
yeah, they meet at the flagpole. But there's my understanding there, however, that was either before or after school hours. Now, granted, it was on public property, which and oftentimes was led by a member of the faculty or administration, which is also outrageous.
Right.
But most of those, as far as I know, never gained too much traction. I've never witnessed it actually, and I know there would be some places around where you could go witness it if it was a common practice. So I don't know, Tim, have you seen any of it?
No, I have not. But I do know that there is one of the churches, or there is a religious group that comes in once a week and does some stuff using the school building, in the school commons area. But other than that, there's not. But again, I'm not sure why they're letting them come in to use that building, and I don't know for sure if they're having to pay to use the facility, which they should be. But I don't know.
Well, my daughter actually came to me a couple of years ago, they had the See You at the Pole thing, and they had these, and I saw the flyers up at the school. It didn't say what it was for. It was just really encouraging students to meet at the flagpole. You know, like, this wonderful thing's going to happen. Everybody meet at the flagpole, and you'll see it. And my daughter said to me, she said, Mom, they were trying to make me meet at the pole, or they were trying to trick me into going to the pole. And I found out later it was for prayer on school property. So they, you know, they try to sneak stuff like that in sometimes. I mean,
Well, they try to do that all the time, sneak it in. But this is, this is something quite different, obviously.
Right.
This is outright passing a law.
Yeah, it's part of school
this
curriculum.
this is taking a whole hour out of education.
Right, and one, and of course they'll claim that it's voluntary, but because of peer pressure, we know how that goes.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
if you're the one or two students that don't leave,
Mhm.
it's obvious you're going to be the target of some ridicule at minimum, and maybe some violence at worst.
Well, and you know what they'll do, because here's the thing: if you just say, okay, period 8, last period day, you can go if you want to go do your worship or whatever. But what's going to end up is that, well, maybe because of a supervisory problem, I could see schools just saying, period 8, we all go to this, or we all go to do that. So
Yeah, or the students that don't, well, guess what? You get to go do trash pickup.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Either this or that.
You could envision something like that being a potential at least.
Right. So a deterrent to not go. There'll be some type of deterrent to.
Yeah. So I mean,
Right.
rather than getting some useful activity, it's going to be some BS punishment.
Right.
Or at least what would qualify as punishment under most circumstances. Now, it always amazes me, though, that they're not expecting a Supreme Court challenge, or if they do get it, and maybe that's what they're hoping for here. Now that the court is much more conservative, although it may not be as conservative as they thought.
Right.
Based on the past week's decisions. But anyway, I suspect they were hoping for a challenge that would, in essence, overturn what we would refer to as the wall of separation, right? So,
Right.
So that would be my guess as to what their long-term objectives would be here, because they've got to know somebody will challenge this. They've got to know that.
And I don't really see it as students probably spearheading this thing. Probably it's a church came by and said, hey, we'll send a bus. But also, if you're going to say to a bunch of students, hey, either you can come do this for the last period of the day off campus, or stay in, study hall or
Sure.
some other sort of, they're gonna pick where they're gonna have like the most freedom. They can probably, yeah.
And guess what else? We just happen to be serving cake and ice cream.
For sure. Yes.
Yeah, and they have all that candy. They always have so much candy.
Yeah.
Last year, the Knox County School Board tested out a release time policy, allowing students to miss just one class a month to attend services at a nearby church. The school board voted 5-4 to end the program in December. The WBIR reported, I guess that's another news source, HB 2542 would overrule the board's decision. Governor Lee did not respond to a request for comment, but he has been vocal about his Christian faith. In 2019, he declared a statewide day of fasting and prayer, the Tennessean reported. Lee told constituents that God would hear their pleas to improve the state's educational system and ease the opioid epidemic.
Well, apparently they're not pleading to God for that relief directly. They've got to go this indirect route.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
I think it might be more effective if they got a direct route, radio.
Not
Indirect.
having much success.
He was quoted to say, the separation of church and state is never intended to keep people of faith out of government, but to keep government out of the church.
Yeah, I think he's a little mixed up there.
Interpretation.
Certainly you want government out of faith, but you also want the exact reciprocal.
Ideally, sure. In 2018, the same governor, Lee, signed a law requiring all schools to display a marker reading "In God We Trust." The release time bill has drawn criticisms from some corners. American Atheists describe HB 2542, and that's a group. American Atheists is a group.
I'm a
As,
member, by the way.
yeah, as the most expansive church release time legislation in the country. So if this happens, we have to worry about the entire country going to something just like it. So we'll have to pay attention to this pretty closely.
Yeah, absolutely. You can bet that there's going to be several other states that will try something similar to this.
Exactly.
So we know it's coming. So absolutely, we have to remain vigilant.
The group's policy analyst, Allison Gill, said Tennessee's church release time bill harms public education throughout the state and therefore student performance, which makes a lot of sense to me. And then she said, to prevent participating students from missing mandatory education, schools would have to cut programming for all students. Okay, by Gill's estimation, that would come to 22.5 missed school days every year for students. Last year, Tennessee came in 38th place in U.S. News and World Reporting ranking of state education systems. So we're looking at like all 50. It's kind of not a great ranking, I don't think. And this is my favorite part of the story, because this is when our friends come in sometimes. On Facebook, the Satanic Children's Ministry of Tennessee seemed to take pleasure in that vote. We've waited so long for that wall of separation to be dismantled so we can get our message out to all children across the state, the group said. We just can't contain our excitement. It's so hard to spread our message as of now, but this will allow us to teach Satanic children the best ways are spreading our teachings to their classmates. So we have an alternative here. Satanism is already the fastest growing religion in Tennessee, the group added. This should help us grow even faster. So we've had a lot of experience where the Satanists come in and help us out, just being kind of on the very other end of the broad spectrum. If you do this, we can do this.
Here's what I'm waiting for, though, and this is where it's such a slippery slope and becomes so dangerous. Is eventually it'll come down that this will only be allowed for Christian religion. Somebody will at least try to propose it. I guarantee it.
And that never works. I don't think that ever works.
Well, it hasn't in the past. It hasn't in the past, but I just really feel like we're almost in a little bit of a different time now. So I hope we're right, and they're not able to.
You wait till the Islamic want you to come to the mosque or whatever. Once they say, well, okay, we want our students to come, or we're inviting students to come visit us, then I can see, like you say,
Sure.
well, we're gonna have to amend that legislation to limit to only certain religions.
Yeah, I mean the floodgates will be open.
Mhm.
You know, if this stands. So
Well, I think it's wonderful that we have groups like the Satanist group to come in and just throw, hey, if you guys do this, we can do this, because it's, tit for tat.
Yep.
sure.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, you're
Exactly.
absolutely right. Well, thanks so much for that story, Tracy.
My pleasure.
We'll be back with more politics and religion after this short break.
Messing with my head again. You had your heart set on me, but these feels, they come and go, and they come so easily. Tell me what it is about you that I can't forget, but you're breaking down my walls again just to set me free. Why do I, baby, why do I love the way you are, we always leave me? Why do I, baby, why do I love the touch but never love the feeling? Why do I, baby, why do I love the way you are, we always leave me? Why do I, baby, why do I love the touch but never love the feeling? Staying up when I go out, you gotta know.
And we're back. Now, some schools in voucher programs list quote unquote counseling as discipline for LGBTQ students. The counseling, a form of conversion therapy, can be seriously harmful. Tim has this story for us, so Tim, fill us in.
So I'm going to talk about a story that appeared in Huffington Post. I think the original, this is an updated of an older story that was published the study was published in 2017. And so this came out in June 10th of 2020. It's titled, "Millions of Taxpayer Dollars Are Going to Schools That Push Conversion Therapy." And the story centered around Megan, who is a 16-year-old high school sophomore at Calvary Christian Academy in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So one day when she was sitting in art class doing her work, she heard her name called over the school intercom, telling her to report to the main office. When Megan arrived at the main office, she was directed into a room by the office secretary, where she found several leaders of the school were there waiting for her. After a few minutes of just some small talk discussion, after a few minutes of small talk, the discussion became very serious. The school staff informed her that she had, quote, was broken and needed fixing. And they believed that anti-gay counseling could be the solution for her. Now, just a few days earlier, Megan had been told she was banned from attending an overnight school trip to a statewide theater competition. And she'd spent several months preparing for this competition and was again, really, looking forward to doing this. But I guess stories had been circulating and were being spread about her sexuality. And the talk was that she had a girlfriend from another school. And so The parents, mothers of classmates, had complained to the administration that their daughters having to share a room with her on this trip.
Oh my gosh.
Yes,
Wow.
and of course, hearing that at that time was obviously a crushing blow, very humiliating to her. That her peers, the thought that her peers and families were afraid of her. And of course, at that time, Megan tried to explain that she would have never done anything inappropriate with another student. Now back at this meeting, school administrators then laid out, here's your options. Again, the group obviously reminded her that they believe the Bible says homosexuality is wrong. Then they told her she would have to attend counseling to discuss her sexuality if she wanted to remain enrolled at the Calvary Christian Academy. So now Megan, who's 21, recanting this event or these events, recalled, quote, I looked around the room and I knew I was outmatched. I had just moved and had nobody. I tried not to react. I felt defeated. So Megan had just started attending the Calvary Academy earlier that school year, and this was in 2014, after moving from Venezuela. And of course, she knew she was gay and that she wouldn't change. But she was also depressed, tired, and afraid of what getting kicked out of school mid-year would mean to college applications in her future. She'd been enduring for months homophobic bullying. She could barely stay awake in class. She was depressed. She had trouble eating, couldn't keep food down. So obviously, psychologically, this was really wearing on her, or had been wearing on her. Megan's family, which she was having kind of a rocky relationship there, and it didn't come right out to say it, but I assume it was because of her homosexuality or maybe gay. Their family though thought that she should remain enrolled in the school, and then so at that point anyway, that her only goal was to just survive. So she agreed to stay at school and then do the counseling. Okay. Now the article also interviewed another student, Andrew, who attended Calvary Christian Academy at the same time as Megan. And the school administrators also pressured him to attend conversion therapy after he reported to them that he had been sexually harassed by another male student. So instead of focusing on the trauma of the harassment, they pushed him to attend counseling and talk about his sexual orientation, which they perceived to be a problem. And Andrew, who was mostly closeted at the time, vehemently denied that he was gay, and kept doing that in front of his school, kind of backed off. But school leaders then just made him meet with a teacher to go over scripture and talk about his life. So of course, the way that Megan and Andrew were treated is deplorable, especially in light of the fact that Calvary Christian Academy is one of at least 9 private schools that participate in voucher tax credit programs and appear to be also pushing LGBTQ students to attend a form of conversion therapy using their, quote, counseling programs. Now in the 2017 Huffington Post investigation, they found that at least 14% of religious schools in voucher programs advertised anti-gay policies or barred LGBTQ students and staff from admission and employment. Now this article then was according to the update to the 2017 Huffington Post study, and they had found that some of these schools go so far as to push medically discredited and often harmful treatment of their students in an attempt to change their sexual orientation. Jason Rochelles, who is the head of the school at Calvary Christian Academy, or now is the head there, of course, told Huffington Post that, quote, anti-gay therapy is not a process we use or a part of a policy at our school. However, he did not dispute any specific part of Megan's account. And now he was there, he was a principal at that time when Megan and Andrew were there. But of course, didn't come out and deny it, but just made that statement. Now, of course, some facts about the money, the state money. There are vouchers and tax breaks that they're receiving. Calvary Christian Academy is a private religious school, of course, received just over $3 million in public funding last year, in 2019, through a variety of state voucher and tax credit programs that help funnel taxpayer dollars to scholarships for private schools. And according to the school website archives, Calvary Christian Academy has participated in these state programs since 2012, at least since 2012. Now, and again, to kind of, for those of you who may not be aware, remember that, or recall, or to define, I guess, a voucher program. And voucher programs use taxpayer money to fund scholarships, which are supposed to go to, or for lower or middle income students that can't rich enough to afford to pay the normal tuition. And then the tax credit programs give individuals and corporations incentives in the form of tax credits for donating to private organizations that have private schools. In other words, donating to private schools, you're going to get that back deducted from your income tax that you may owe, okay? Or get a tax break on that. Of course, advocates say these programs help level playing field by giving poorer students the ability to choose the school that works best for them, and gives them an option that more affluent students have always had. But that just sounds so nice and Christian-like. But what comes out in this report is that we have taxpayer dollars supporting institutions that not only open discriminate against LGBTQ children, but also push them toward programs that have long been debunked by mainstream medical and mental health institutions and often cause severe harm. A study from 2018 found that LGBTQ people who had received interventions from religious leaders, therapists, and parents trying to change their sexual orientation were 3 more times likely to attempt suicide than other LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
20 states and the District of Columbia banned licensed health professionals from practicing conversion therapies on minors. Florida is not one of those states. Casey Pick, who is a senior fellow for advocacy and government affairs at the Trevor Project, which is a nonprofit focused on suicide prevention for LGBTQ youth, is quoted in the article as saying, schools are places where youth should feel free and safe and have the opportunity to grow, mature into their best selves. Instead, they find themselves under threat from a practice that has no basis in science and is tied to potential significant harm. So the Huffington Post, and part of this is in that, well, I think this is all from the 2017 study. They looked through handbooks, statements of faith, and then prospective student application forms of more than 500 schools that had previously identified as having anti-gay policies. And they also looked at websites, handbooks, statement of faith, and applications of more than 7,500 private schools around the country receiving public funding through voucher or tax credit programs in 2017 to identify which of those schools were religiously affiliated as well as which had advertised anti-LGBTQ views. Okay. Now, they didn't find a lot as far as that were actively advertising that. They found that at least 8 schools with handbooks that seemed to openly require or encourage some form of counseling for kids experiencing same-sex attraction, which experts say often acts as a euphemistic term for conversion therapy. Mm. The Huffington Post reached out to each of those schools with questions about what this counseling looked like. Only one responded saying that the pastor or trained professional providing the counseling decides on what type of, quote, help to provide the students. They also found 4 additional schools whose handbooks had vague policies indicating but not explicit, really stating that anti-LGBTQ counseling could be a consequence for same-sex attraction or gender nonconformity. According to Casey Pick, these policies are typically intentionally vague. That way schools have a great amount of discretion and can also avoid scrutiny from the outside world. Because of unintentionally vague policies, it's believed that the number of private religious schools who receive vouchers and tax credits and have anti-LGBTQ policies is probably a lot higher. And then Calvin Christian Academy is kind of an example, perfect example of this, of having these vague policy statements. In its website, it says the school believes that, quote, acceptable sexual behavior is exclusively reserved to occur within the confines of a monogamous marriage union of a consenting man and woman. But it doesn't publicly promote or support any conversion therapy. Okay? But it's, it obviously makes it clear, what they believe. So no, just, privately, don't tell anyone, but God wants us to turn you all straight. So, so that's what they're saying. It's believed that many other schools quietly promote conversion therapy without stating so in public materials, and of course, they're not going to. They're not going to say that. They also state in the article that more states have adopted or expanded their voucher or tax credit programs since they created the database in 2017. And any schools that have benefited from these programs for the first time over the last 3 years were not reflected in the count. So they believe that there's probably a lot more out there, these private schools or private religious schools that are receiving state credits and voucher tax breaks. Currently, there are 29. Currently, voucher and tax credit programs exist in 29 states and the District of Columbia. And so again, some of these schools make the policies very clear. For example, Westwood Christian School in Miami, which received nearly 1.3 million this year via voucher and tax credit programs, outlines its policy in its handbook. It makes parents promise that if their child, quote, believes that he or she is gay, homosexual, lesbian, or bisexual, we will encourage such child to disclose the situation to the senior pastor or administrator and seek guidance and counseling through the church.
As if there's something wrong with them.
Yes.
That's terrible.
Right, and it's insane. It says and the child will be asked to withdraw if administration learns that the child has not sought counseling and has refused counseling or has participated in any homosexual activity after church counseling, then they'll be basically kicked out. And the schools that maintain these policies are all across the country. But again, a lot of this is probably under wraps and not known real well. So collectively, all the schools Huffington Post found to push conversion therapy received over $8 million in public funding during the last school year, for which public information was available. And then the concern is that public funding for private schools, which could potentially be ones with the discriminatory policies, may increase in the near future. And of course, the push for this increase is being fueled from the very top. We have the Wicked Witch of the Northeast, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, has under her position of power trying to increase private schools and voucher programs and tax breaks. Of course, now she's had a little success with COVID-19 pandemic. New program allows states to apply for federal coronavirus relief dollars to help families cover school expenses, and technologies, and then also private tuition can be used to help. Those COVID dollars can be used for that as well. Public school advocates say it's part of DeVos's larger agenda to shift funding away from public school system, which public school systems, 90% of the kids in the country are being educated in public school systems.
Sure.
And of course, what school vouchers and tax credit will do, or is doing, is taking vital state funding dollars away from public schools, and by doing so could cause budget shortfalls for public schools, which in turn could lead to increases in property taxes to fill in for the lost revenue, the lost state revenue. So then it gets put on property tax burden. And then just to kind of end here too, another concern with using vouchers and tax credits for private education was discussed in Education Week article on June 17th this year. It was titled "Private School Choice Programs Fall Short of Transparency and Accountability." And according to the article from the EdWeek Research Center survey of looking at surveying states at how private school vouchers and other closely regulated programs or related programs are regulated, very few private schools have to follow some of these policy standards used to ensure transparency and accountability in other public schools. So some of the big takeaways from that survey: just 6 states require that all participating private schools admit students regardless of their religion. Only 3 require participating private schools to admit students regardless of their sexual orientation.
3?
Yeah.
Wow.
Only 11 require that all teachers in participating private schools have a bachelor's degree.
What? Okay.
Yeah, they need to have a bachelor's degree. 14, at least 14 though, mandated that schools conduct criminal background checks on all staff before accepting tuition paid with the help of state aid. Only 6 states require schools to publicly report their graduation rates, the private schools. And then of those and other findings demonstrated the relatively thin state oversight these programs operate under, especially when compared to the tight regulation and governance that we see in public schools.
Yeah, gosh. I think we're going to have to go to discussion here.
Yep.
Just quickly, I have a couple points I want to make. To me, what this boils down to is the automatic, or at least what seems to be automatic approval by state and local governments of allowing religious institutions to carry out education in the first place.
Right.
And the same has been true for other types of things like childcare, for example. If you try to set up a private childcare institution or whatever you want to call it, try to do that and not be a religious organization, it's incredible the amount of paperwork you have to go through.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you simply declare yourself a church, oh, you're qualified.
Here you go.
Right. And of course, what that leads to is, as you pointed out, very well, is a lack of oversight. Nothing is verified. There are no standards, or at least very few, and it just simply leads to shoddy education as well as violation of civil rights.
Sure.
And they're able to get away with it simply by placing themselves with a religious label.
Exactly.
And the worst part about this is that the victims are teenagers and kids.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really, it impacts the community, but mostly the kids have to suffer.
Right. One of our common themes
Yeah.
in public school and all public schools, and obviously the one I'm at, is that you first look at whatever you're doing. Is it you look at what's best for the kids? What you're doing is that what's best for kids?
Exactly.
Right. And obviously that should always be the bottom line for an educational institution.
Right.
I think we're going to have to leave that discussion there, and we'll be back with our crazy story of the week.
I'm feeling so hollow. Don't you know? And don't you know? I'm living in shadow. Don't you know? And don't you know? I fell for fool's gold. I fell for fool's gold. What did I know? What did I know? I fell for fool's gold. I fell for fool's gold. What did I know? What did I know? And you were fool's gold. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
And we're back with our crazy story of the week. There is nothing that can cause a belly laugh, an eye roll, or a face palm quicker than faith-based quote-unquote science. We now have that eminent faith-based scientist, Mary Colbert, telling us why we have climate change. Tracy has our crazy story of the week. So Tracy, what do you have for us?
This I've had to kind of read this several times because I'm not gonna lie, it kind of gave me the giggles. Like I couldn't stop laughing at everything about this, and for a minute I didn't even think it was real. I was looking for like the Onion, coming from the Onion or something like that, but apparently this is a real thing.
Yeah.
Okay, the story's called Christian Activist Mary Colbert. Is it Colbert?
Colbert, I believe, yeah.
Sin, not climate change, causes extreme weather.
Well, that would explain why we get it more in the southeast.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Faith-based science. Christian activist and author Mary Colbert claims it is sin and not climate change that is causing extreme weather and natural disasters. And this is a story from a year ago, but apparently this is a timely subject because you can't get people to not go with stuff like this. Anyway, appearing on the Jim Baker Show last year, Colbert claimed that extreme weather and natural disasters have nothing to do with climate change, but instead they're a result of sin. In addition, Colbert blamed Satan for using the issue of climate change to distract from the fact that the end times are rapidly approaching. Last time I talked to Satan, that's what he said. Exactly. On the program, Colbert declared, "The devil knows what is in the Word of God. I truly believe that because he knows what the Word says, that toward the end times, earthquakes, tornadoes," that's how she pronounces it, by the way. You say tornado, I say whatever. Tornadoes, storms, all these things are going to happen as the birth pangs of the return of Jesus Christ. Now the enemy is trying to change that narrative for the mindset of the people that this has to do with climate change, so that they can believe it's something outside of their control that is happening, because clearly climate change is directly related to what she's talking about. The thing that man needs to do is repent. Repentance would delay things, But because of this hard-heartedness and evil that is increasing, the birth pangs of the earth are getting worse. It has nothing to do with coal. It has nothing to do with climate change. It has to do with the sin nature that's increasing in the earth. I mean, if we could just curb that down, you know, the weather wouldn't be so bad. Colbert, an influential conservative Christian activist and pro-Trump Christian leader, previously claimed that all those who oppose or criticize President Trump will be cursed, as will their children and their grandchildren, because according to Colbert, Trump has been chosen by God. And this is not the only time I've ever heard of this in a public,
And it's a public forum.
the government, people running for mayor or whatever, they often say, you know, God asked me to do this. It's usually a quote from God that gets them involved in this. And it's basically whoever says it first is who gets to go with that story. But the bottom line, Christian activist and author Mary Colbert claims it is sin. And yeah, okay, we covered that already. And that's the end of the story, because, I mean, there's not much you need to add to that. Besides her, or do people think that? Are there others? Does anybody know if there are others?
Everybody watching Tammy Baker or Jim Baker.
Jim Baker, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So who is the enemy? Is the enemy scientists or just non-believers or?
All of it. Scientific non-believers.
Okay.
Non-believers, science-based non-believers.
remember that Rush Limbaugh calls science one of the 4 pillars of deceit.
Mm.
So this, I'm serious. I mean, this is deep seated within the right wing nuts of this country. This notion. And of course, if we just hadn't have had Eve bite that apple, we wouldn't have sin in the first place.
Wow.
Right. Exactly.
Women ruin everything.
It's true. We do. It's true.
Oh, wow. Well, all I can say is that is the crazy story of the week. Yeah. No question about it. Thanks so much, Tracy, for relaying that to us.
Sure thing.
Well, that will wrap us up for this week. If you have enjoyed our program, please pass the word to your friends and associates, believers and non-believers alike. Again, just a reminder that you are welcome to post questions and comments on our Facebook page. Sounds reasonable. We look forward to next week when we will present another episode of Sounds Reasonable. Remember, there is a big difference between having good reasons for what one accepts to be true and having bad ones. Incidentally, this is the only distinction one needs to become a strict atheist. This has been Dr. Brad for Tracy and Tim saying so long.
Bye. Next week. See ya.